Welcome to our event, Distressing Language, Disability and the Poetics of Error, with Professor Michael Davidson. This event is co-sponsored by the Health Humanities Initiative and the Irish Cultural Center in downtown Phoenix. And thank you to the Humanities Institute and Director Curtis Austin, but especially to Victoria Day and Jacob Leviton for all your help putting on the event and helping us manage all of its different modalities, which is no easy task. So I'm Annika Mann. I'm an associate professor of English and affiliate faculty in disability studies on the West Valley campus of ASU. And I also co-direct the Health Humanities Initiative at ASU with Cora Fox, right over here. And we're thrilled to have Michael Davidson with us today. I'm going to give just a very short introduction to Dr. Davidson's work before giving things over to his talk. But I wanted to just note for everyone that the goal of the Health Humanities Initiative is to bring faculty, students, and community members together on the very broad topic of humanities and health. And that could be things ranging from disability studies and the history of medicine to narrative medicine, bioethics, and biocultural studies. And we're hoping to have another event in the spring in what will become a regular series of events. So if you have ideas for events you would be excited about, speakers, workshops, please come chat with us after this event. We would be very excited to hear about those ideas. But to come back to today, so Professor Michael Davidson is Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of California, San Diego. And his work has been important to so many fields, particularly studies of modernism, contemporary poetry, and gender and sexuality studies. Beyond field-shaping books in those areas, he is also the editor of the collected poems of George Uppen, as well as the author of 8 books of poetry himself. But Professor Davidson's most recent scholarly contributions have enriched the fields of disability studies, deaf studies, sound studies, and studies of aging. His important work in these areas includes the monographs Concerto for the Left Hand, Disability and the Defamiliar Body, 2008, Invalid Modernism, Disability and the Missing Body of the Aesthetic from 2019, and most recently what we'll hear about today, Distressing Language, Disability and the Poetics of Error, which we're really lucky to hear about today. And I'll let him educate us further on distressing language, but I think for me what most excites me about his work in general and this book in particular is the really remarkable way it thinks from the position of disability and vulnerability to open up avenues for the reconsideration of form and meaning making. So even as distressing language considers how errors of mishearing or misspeaking reveal what he describes as, quote, those sensory logics that organize what pass for truth, this scholarship also widens our sense of the genre of poetry by presenting a new archive of cultural productions that feature errors. So in so doing, distressing language reveals how generative errors are, how they are, as he puts it, I think really beautifully, constitutive of novel ways of thinking and doing. So to borrow from his language, I find this work on disability gain so generative, and I look forward to hearing more today. So please welcome Michael Davidson.
Thank you, Annika, and thanks to the Humanities Institute for inviting me, and to Patrick Bixby for inviting me to Phoenix, where I could experience the sublimity of heat. Patrick suggested maybe I'd talk a little bit about my career trajectory, as it's called, that led me to disability studies. And a lot of my earlier work was about modern and contemporary poetry, and the through line in most of that work had to do with the politics of form, or the ideology of form. I'm an unreconstructed formalist. I still believe in close readings, but I'm also aware that when language changes, when language is challenged, when the form of the poem moves from the Alexandrine in French to free verse in Mallarmé, that big things are happening, not just in the poem, but they are reflective of, and more importantly, productive of changes in the social world. So that was very important for me to think about poetry outside of my new critical upbringing, and to think about poetry as having real purchase on social change and historical conditions. So when I began to lose my hearing in the mid-1990s, I had to think a lot about the terms that we use for poetics and prosody, rhyme, meter, alliteration, voice, orality, text. All of those words we take for granted as being the characteristic of literature now all of a sudden had to be, for me, done differently. What would it be like for a poem to be signed on the body? What would it be like to think about orality from the standpoint of somebody who doesn't speak? What is it like to have a conversation like this without sound? All of those things had to be reincorporated. So things shifted dramatically around the issue of what literature was, and then I also had to think much more about what the aesthetic function was. Was it to evaluate works of art on their access to disinterested appreciation, to beauty, coherence? Or was there always lurking in aesthetic discourse, at least from the Enlightenment up to the present, the idea that there had to be a grotesque body, a disabled body, a queer body, that mandated that there be something that is better, something that is more pure, something more beautiful? So I began to think about aesthetics in general, and I talked about the issue of aesthetics in this book called Invalid Modernism or Invalid Modernism. I like the interplay between the two ideas, that there might be another invalid modernism hiding in the one that we all are taught and teach in our classes. So that's the rough outline of the trajectory, such as it is. Oops. Let me recite what disability teaches. Disability teaches. During my last 10 years of teaching, my hearing began to diminish rather precipitously. I had increasing trouble hearing student comments and began to leave the lectern and move out into the classroom, standing next to the one speaking and asking them to repeat the question. This was an advantage to me as a teacher, but it also benefited other students who may have missed the question themselves. The more I taught and the more my hearing declined, the better my teaching became, because I left my notes at the front of the class and became part of the class itself. I'm recording myself on my iPhone, but I don't really need to know what I'm talking about. Which leads to an epigraph, a variation on Gertrude Stein's famous lines from her Picasso portrait. Let me recite what history teaches. History teaches. My variation suggests that disability is a pedagogical project, a form of instruction about one's capabilities and the social limits to their realization. You can study disability history, the representation of disabled figures in literature, the history of eugenics, disability memoirs, but the lived experience of disability is always a lesson in what the world expects of a body-mind. I use the term body-mind to indicate that, at least in disability studies, we don't think of the body and the mind as these Cartesian separation, but rather they're part of a complex that need to be always kept together. When you don't fit into a putative norm of speech, hearing, intelligence, movement, size, or shape, you learn what that norm is, what makes a human count as human. Let me return to the front of the class. The art historian, Amanda Kacha, realized that the lecterns for this thing, for teaching and talks, tended to erase her short-statured body, so that when delivering a lecture, she was all but invisible to her audience. Working with engineering students in a design lab, she created a portable short lectern, an altar podium, as she calls it, that she now takes to conferences and classes. It's a practical solution to a pedagogical problem, but it's also an aesthetic response to her practice. one that teaches the audience about difference while permitting discussion of it. Amy Hamray, this is Amanda at a conference using the altar podium. Amy Hamray, H-A-M-R-A-E, calls this approach to design access knowledge, to suggest that accommodation is more than a matter of removing barriers. It is epistemological, the kinds of knowing that would make it possible to design a world with disability in mind. Access knowledge also involves the vernacular, often subversive strategies that persons with disabilities use to retrofit inadequate design features in ergonomics, transcription, communication, architecture, and technology. Such strategies include the ways that individuals create their own tools, curb cuts, and ramps with repurposed materials, learn to code and hack computers, and tinker with the structures of everyday life. It also includes the design of a lectern to suit a specific user. I want to extend Hamray's idea of access knowledge to the aesthetic sphere, specifically to understand how what society regards as errors of embodiment and cognition are generative for novelty in art. Error, at least since Aristotle based his Poetics on the crippled, blind Oedipus, has been an important feature in aesthetics. As applied to post-war poetics and visual art, the duplicity of error haunts an ideology of authenticity and immediacy. If to err is human, then to display error, whether in dance, painting, or poetry, is to display the human in its most variable and precarious form. Can you hear me? Am I speaking? I can't hear my voice, so it's a little difficult to know if I'm projecting enough. My recent book, Distressing Language, is full of errors, typos, misheard lyrics, cracks in the cement, music without sound, mondegreens, captioning mistakes, sound distortion, interference, speech impediments, printing overstrikes, smudged drawings, erased words, computer glitches, interrupted conversations, and broken glass. The latter refers to Marcel Duchamp's Large Glass, subtitled The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, that when returning from its inaugural exhibition in the Brooklyn Museum in 1926, was damaged in transit. Its double glass panes shattered into multiple cracks. This is what you see when you go to the Philadelphia Art Museum. There's Duchamp behind it. I think you can see the cracks in the glass. Duchamp remarked that fortuitously the cracks imitated the pattern of lines in his 1914 work, Network of Stoppages, and now seemed like an integral part of the work. He said, quote, "It's a lot better with the breaks, 100 times better. It's the destiny of things," unquote. It's worth pondering the idea that things have destiny, or that in Sarah Ahmed's terms, Ahmed, A-H-M-E-D, Sarah Ahmed's terms, they can be happy and can organize relations both past and future. For Duchamp, breaks in the glass are not flaws or mistakes, but intentional events integral to the evolution of the work. The transformation of an error into new art, or a new discourse about art, is characteristic of Duchamp's oeuvre in general, in which dust particles in the artist's studio or random commercial objects, urinals, bottle dryers, shovels, become works of art. It marks a moment when the glass of retinal art is broken, its cracks exposing the material nature of transparency upon which a certain idea is based. Although Duchamp was not, as far as I know, disabled, unless playing chess is a disability, but I don't know any other historical background on that. There's a lesson here about error's foundational role in reassigning meaning to the non-traditional body. Mistakes of hearing, walking, temporality, understanding, and seeing are part of disability experience. Furthermore, such errors are at the heart of disability politics. In this, I'm taking a page from Jack Halberstam's work on queer failure and those ways of being and knowing that stand outside of conventional understandings of success, as he says. Halberstam notes that in a heteronormative capitalist economy, failure is not an option, and that goals must include personal responsibility, independence, and self-reliance. For queers, and I would add Crips, failure can be a style, which stands in contrast to the grim scenarios of success that depend upon trying and trying again. In this book, I apply the lessons of Crip failure to blur the barrier between able-bodied and disabled artists, finding that focusing only on disabled artists reifies disability as a discrete aesthetic category without recognizing the broad spectrum of embodiment across the life course. One is not born disabled. One becomes disabled in a society that treats the different body-mind as a tragic loss or deviance. And one becomes disabled at different points over time. Someone who loses their hearing later in life occupies a very different cultural modality from someone who is deaf from birth. The seizure that paralyzed the artist Chuck Close in 1987 dramatically modified the texture of his large portraits, whereas the poetry of Larry Eigner, who lived with cerebral palsy from birth, varied only slightly throughout his career. Is the Beethoven of the early Opus 10 piano sonatas the same composer who wrote the late quartets and piano sonatas after becoming profoundly deaf? Whenever a poem, quote, "And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see," was she reliving moments of temporary blindness as a young woman? Perhaps the question becomes not what is disability, but when. Word about my title, Distressing Language. It's a verbal conundrum, combining a category of design with a condition of affect. Distressed clothing, pre-ripped jeans, aged leather, rough textured furniture depend on the simulation of wear and tear, a stylistic marker of use that adds a patina of history to contemporary materials. But the term also refers to affective realms of trouble and anxiety, the distress of learning of a person's death, the tension produced by aggressive actions or hate speech. In distressing language, I confuse both senses to describe work that makes language strange, troubling, loud, or difficult. Language that roughens the surface, effaces clarity, dissolves in puns and homonyms, offers a kind of verbal static that interrupts linear communication and calls attention to the unstable nature of language. It also refers to the appropriation of previous uses and associations that leave their distressed mark on the surface. Distributed voice. This is a current obsession of mine, not only in this book, but in work that I'm doing now. The issue of voice is a recurrent theme in the book. What I call distributed voice refers to the social and cultural values assigned to having a voice, both socially and audiologically. In the former case, when members of a persecuted or marginalized group are not listened to, they experience what Jill Stauffer, Stauffer, calls ethical loneliness in a world that refuses to hear their voices as legitimate. Having a voice is usually thought of as a unitary phenomenon, the audible trace of selfhood, what Derrida calls phonocentrism. Yet voice is multiple. Take the issue of captions. I conduct everyday communication via voice recognition software on an app called AVA, A-V-A, that transcribes conversations through my smartphone's microphone. Take a bow. That's what AVA looks like. If you want to get it for yourselves or you have friends who are hard of hearing and could use some help, they look for a blue ampersand on the App Store. It's free. AVA uses natural language processing, NLP, to anticipate what a speaker is saying using algorithms to draw plausible words from a vast database. The more familiar the system becomes with one's voice, the more it adjusts its transcriptions to suit qualities of inflection and accent. It has become my major form of communication in public situations, doctors' offices, markets, government offices, but also serves as a lifeline to personal communication with friends and family. For me, voice is distributed through a set of sound waves, a set of algorithms, a transduction process, a text that appears on a screen. It also uses up a lot of battery, so I have to remember to turn it off, or I won't be able to have a conversation with you afterwards. Where am I? For me, voice is distributed through a set of blah, blah, blah. Ava is remarkably accurate, often transcribing exact technical terms, foreign language words, and proper nouns, but as with any form of transcription, errors creep in, and depending on the distortion will produce some distressing language. It's a good person to go with a dark trail. Embassy map, very cool. I have a hat, but I don't. Cocoa and clear soup and oranges and oatmeal. Whist bottom, whist close, woodland. Cocoa, clear soup and oranges and oatmeal. Pain soup. Suppose it is question. Suppose it is butter. Real is only X. Best meal. You want to pay. Okay, you don't. I like it. Boiler companies. Boiler companies. This for flatbread. Did you put my glasses on when there's sauce? A single example of excellence is in the meat. A bent stick is surging, and all might is mental. A grand close is searching out a candle, not that Wheatley, not that by more than an owl and a path. A jam is proud of coconut. In recent conversations, finds tender buttons to suggest that inaccuracies are often pretty, and miscaptioning bears a close resemblance to avant-garde writing, or vice versa. It's a good person to go with a dark trail. Embassy map, very cool. I have a hat, but I don't. Sounds more like Stein than last year's Thanksgiving dinner conversation, which is where it appeared. By linking Stein captioning errors, I don't mean to suggest that her writing is error the way that voice recognition captioning is. Rather, I see her exploring the same kinds of associative processes and substitutions by which NLP captioning programs work. In poetry, in her essay, Poetry and Grammar, she famously disparages nouns in favor of the mobile quality of verbs and adverbs, grammatical elements that are, she says, on the move. And in their aliveness come possibilities for error. She says, it is wonderful the number of mistakes a verb can make. When the deaf artist Christine Sun Kim, you may have seen Christine Sun Kim, she was asked to sign the Star-Spangled Banner at the Super Bowl a few years ago, but you didn't see her because in the wisdom of the football league, they showed pictures of the football players and the singers, but the person who was signing was not visible. She wrote a wonderful response in the opinion column of the New York Times, which is worth reading. Anyway, when Christine Sun Kim draws on the voices of others in her installations, she describes it as a form of leasing the voice. Kim's economic metaphor stresses the degree to which deaf people understand voice and sound as a social value. Leasing the voice of others means borrowing the means of vocal production for critical ends. She both cites, S-I-T-E-S, and cites, C-I-T-E-S, around cites sound. The spatial representation of sounded materials, from urban street noise to studio spaces to musical notation, shifts acoustic to visual and haptic information. For her to cite sound is to assume control over its social meaning and rearticulate its authority. Many of her collaborative works involve repurposing verbal or textual matter from a deaf vantage. In Close Readings from 2015, she addresses the captioning of films in which diegetic sound is often reduced to a simple phrase: music in background, crowd noise, sound of thunder. Kim asked 4 deaf friends to provide captions for expressive moments in film clips from 5 mainstream films that deal in various ways with vocalization. In her video installations, she blurred part of the image to emphasize the caption text, placing the deaf caption in parentheses above the official version. In this image, taken from Disney's The Little Mermaid, a movie in which the heroine, Ariel, relinquishes her voice and her fins for 2 legs so she can marry the prince, the official caption reads, quote, "Whoa, whoa, careful, easy," to describe the prince's words to the now upright, if unsteady mermaid. The deaf caption of the scene, quote, "The failure of gesture," places emphasis on another equally relevant aspect of the scene, since in it, Ariel attempts to communicate with the prince using a sort of ad hoc sign language. Her awkward attempts are, indeed, a failure of gesture, analogous in various ways to becoming, as it were, a fish out of water in an able-bodied world. In another image from the same film, the deaf caption concerning the moment Ariel relinquishes her voice, quote, "sound of voice being extracted," a phrase that captures the vertiginous implications of what it might mean for a deaf person to live in a world where the loss of voice is a tragic disability. The Disney company felt that the sound of Ariel's voice being extracted by the evil sea witch, Ursula, required no caption, and yet the scene's affective power for the deaf viewer is understandably powerful. Kim titles this series Close Readings, perhaps as a satire on formalist textual interpretation, but also as a description of a more insurrectionary kind of deaf hermeneutics. By putting the captioning in the hands of a deaf viewer and not a hearing interpreter, the film's expressive content is expanded and enlarged. The deaf captions respond to affective elements. You'd say emotional elements in a scene, but I'm thinking of affect as the physiological response to something after which an emotional term is then laid upon that experience. I'll show you what I mean in a second. They respond to affective elements in a scene, how it feels for a deaf individual to reimagine the trauma of Ariel's loss of voice and her fumbling attempts at sign language. In a similar sense, reading affectively is the subject of visual artist Liza Sylvester's works. As someone with significant hearing loss and who has a cochlear implant surgery, she defines herself as an individual who is medically, although not culturally, deaf. In her 2018 film Captioned, she creates what she calls a self-commentary on Howard Hawks' 1934 screwball comedy 20th Century, starring John Barrymore and Carole Lombard. Rather than captioning the film's famously hectic dialogue, she recorded her own reactions to every scene and every hour of the hour-and-a-half film. The tension between fast-paced dialogue and reflective commentary is often startling and occasionally funny, creating an entirely different movie. Preston Sturges films and this one and screwball comedy is usually about speech. Language is going about really fast. And so Liza is watching this and just recording what these images are suggesting to her because she's not hearing the dialogue, of course. Sylvester's choice of 20th Century, you can see the movie. It's easily available on YouTube and Criterion Channel. Barrymore is this theatrical impresario who brings this lingerie model played by Carol Lombard, into the theater, and he's a very abusive person, and she doesn't like working for him. She's very good. In fact, she enhances his theater, and he starts to make a lot of money. Then she leaves for Hollywood and becomes really famous in Hollywood, so he tries to tempt her back. Definitely a movie worth watching. Sylvester's headnote to the piece, called Captioning, says that her caption interpretations include visual observations, plot assumptions, interpretations, and also the thoughts that cross my mind as it wanders due to the boredom and strain of the event. Her recaptioning focuses on her phenomenological encounter with the film, a record of reactions, asides, and associations. It shares some similarities with audio description provided for persons with sight impairment, but focuses less on the details of what is on the screen than what those events trigger in her own mind. Her affective response calls attention to an alternate film hidden in the talking film, one that implicates the viewer when captions are not supplied. The rapid repartee between characters in 20th century effaces any hope of lip reading, leading to frustration. She gets very angry at this film. At the points where it's very funny, her reactions are quite the opposite. So it's almost like watching a completely different film from the standpoint of someone not understanding what's going on. And boy, do I understand that experience. You know, when I go to the airport to take a plane, and the gate change announcement is only done acoustically, verbally, I damn near missed my flight. This happened a couple of times. So I understand that rage that she's talking about. Deaf and hard of hearing people have an especially acute sense of what it means to distribute the voice. As users of technological interfaces, FaceTime, TDY, interpreters, captions, hearing aids, cochlear implants, and the varying signs for audition, voice, talk, conversation, deaf chatter. My favorite one, this is big mouth. You know, this is a satire of a conversation among a lot of hearing people around a table with a deaf person at the other end, and this is what you're hearing. Shifts among several sites, permitting in Kim's case a deaf revision of Disney's captions, or in Sylvester's case, an active response to fast-paced dialogue. Voice is not only an acoustic, who owns and defines the authority of speech. Its value among other senses, in terms developed by the philosopher Jacques Rancière, R-A-N-C-I-E-R-E, in his terms, is to redistribute its social value. Sylvester's intervention into the soundscape of film provokes the question, what does it mean to sound good? William Cheng, C-H-E-N-G, is a very interesting book on what it means to sound good. He points out it usually means sounding authoritative, values that may impress people, win arguments, and elevate one's status. Sounding bad, on the other hand, or what we would call misspeaking, may require a therapeutic regime that would restore speech to some standard. Misspeaking reveals the fragile basis on which social acceptability is based and measured. It is not necessarily, contra Freud, a sign of repressed psychic material, but an inevitable expression of language's unstable nature. What Cheng introduces into our discussion of verbal error is the role of disability in producing socially acceptable speech. Persons for whom speech is physically difficult or rendered in alternative forms such as sign language, or for whom cognitive disabilities make speaking difficult, for such individuals, sounding good is a moving target. The first time I heard Larry Eigner speak was in the middle of a presentation I was giving at an MLA panel on contemporary poetry. He was there in the audience with several other poets, Ron Silliman, Robert Grenier, David Bromwich. And halfway through my talk, Larry began to speak. Cerebral palsy from birth affected his speech, making it hard to decipher. Nor was he reticent about speaking, as I found to my dismay. As confused as I was about being interrupted, I was also interested in this detour in the most characteristic academic ritual, a panel of professors professing. It was even more important that the panel topic concerned a generation of contemporary poets for whom orality was paramount. And there was Larry Aigner, one of the most important figures in the post-war poetry movement, commenting in the midst, not in the Q&A of the presentation. Nothing could have been more appropriate, given the topic, than to have the actual poet present in the room interrupting the presentation and speaking in an indecipherable manner, indecipherable at least to me. As I remember, I asked Larry to repeat his comment, but it was no use, and so I stumbled and flailed until my time was up. This is Larry in his home in Berkeley, and everything was at chair level, so he could access paper poems that he would put into various folders, and he had to, of course, have access to his table. And this is a picture of him typing on, he had to use a manual typewriter because a electric typewriter, he had too many keys in it, so he needed a manual typewriter that he had more control, because he only had use of one finger to type. I'll talk about that in a minute. In retrospect, what I have learned about this experience is what my time means in a disability context. Iger's interruption of my talk offered another way to think about the performance of knowledge, a reparative version that requires diversions and surprises rather than the completion of a prepared speech. And it is an awareness that contemporary poets, often with Aigner as a model, have put to good use in interrupting thought, allowing for asides and distraction, delaying closure, and jettisoning conventional rhetorical markers of time, place, and person. The time of speaking and speaking in time may be two very different things, as persons who require more time intervene in the chronometric dependency syndrome in which we live. If you speak with a stutter, thick accent, or verbal tic, time takes its time. For Aigner himself, writing poetry was a labor-intensive activity, since he had only the use of his right index finger. In a marginal comment in one poem, I'm not sure if you can read this. In a marginal comment, he writes, "Slow is the poem," marking through enjambment the slow process of typing one letter at a time. Aigner's distressing speech is linked not only to temporal matters, but also to his long environmental concerns. The two issues are joined when we think of the multiple temporalities of non-human animals and organisms, plants, and weather patterns. To speak well, to sound good, is to be human. Not sounding good links one to the non-human or animal world, a fact that Aigner thematized in an early poem. I have felt it as they've said. There is nothing to say. There is everything to speak of. But the words are words. When you speak, that is a sound. What have you done when you have spoken? Of nothing or something I will remember. After trying my animal noise, I break out with a man's cry. The poem acknowledges the impact of speech by others. I have felt it as they've said, and reflects on the claim that, quote, there is nothing to say, when in fact, quote, there is everything to speak of. He tests the inertness of words in their materiality. When you speak, that is a sound, against the something that gives it voice in memory. He recognizes that to speak is a speech act. What have you done? when you have spoken, that performs as much as it represents. The recalcitrance of words to say something is an auditory limit for Aigner that he captures in the final couplet. After trying my animal noise, I break out with a man's cry. Although the line breaks make parsing Aigner's intent difficult, he speaks of a barrier between what his words sound like to others, a kind of animal noise, and what they represent for him, a man's cry. The poem refuses to side with either animal noise or human speech, but rather sees them in terms developed by Mel Chen, C-H-E-N, as sites on an animacy continuum. In other words, the separation of animals and humans traditionally is like this, and the animacy continuum for Mel Chen is a spectrum. The ambiguities of agreement and modification that characterize this and many of his poems are evidence of his multi-stable perspective, a recognition that he inhabits a body-mind defined by others, while at the same time living beyond it. In becoming animal, or by regarding his utterance as animal noise, Aigner establishes both his presence as a speaking subject while acknowledging a temporal and epistemological distance. Aigner spoke of one can see his physical condition reflected in poems that concern his lifelong interest in environmentalism. I'm using the typeface that he used on his typewriter, and Stanford University, in publishing the 4-volume collected Aigner, maintained, thanks to the editor, Robert Grenier, maintained the exact typeface that was used, which I think is a brilliant. Tongue-tied and muscle-bound, years, or the seasons, leaves, and snow. Aigner decisively does not say, quote, "Since I am tongue-tied and muscle-bound, I experience years and seasons by observing the changing leaves and the arrival of snow." By leaving out relevant connectives, he correlates relationships between physical limits and seasonal change, between his physical voice and natural growth, between muscle-bound as a definition of athletic ability and as muscular constriction. If he is tongue-tied, the very fact of the poem belies speechlessness. One might call Aigner's poetics an embodied eco-poetics, manifested through his numerous references to birds seen out the window and that serve as a measure of the present space and time. But they also serve as a trigger for his own precarity. And here's Larry reading it. I hope. Could you hear the sound all right? Okay. The lines deal in various ways with vulnerability, all the dimensions that measure normative growth and inevitable decline. Perhaps influenced by a nature program or his extensive reading in environmental literature, Aigner begins by noting that birds have the warmest blood in the world, allowing them constant movement against the threat of becoming a stationary target. While brooding on the let me go back to the poem so you can actually. While brooding on the mortality of birds, he switches to human vulnerability, alluding obliquely to his own precarious birth, in which a forceps injury during delivery led to his cerebral palsy. Precarity joins vulnerable birds to humans, links material head to imagination, to soar in the mind. This mobile-like structure of the poem permits the two realms, avian and anthropomorphic, to reflect on each other. The poem is not about the onset of the poet's disability so much as the degree to which a different head permits identification with other species, birds, and spaces, so big the earth. So, to conclude, in queer phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed, A-H-M-E-D, speaks of what happens when a person becomes disabled as a form of disorientation. She says, quote, "It is by understanding how we become oriented in moments of disorientation that we might learn what it means to be oriented in the first place." Let me read that again. "It is by understanding how we become oriented in moments of disorientation that we might learn what it means to be oriented in the first place. The presumption of oral conversation is challenged when rendered into text on a screen. The sight lines of conversation assume greater importance when one needs to read lips. The boundaries of the poem shift when we know that the poet types with only one finger. Disorientation produces a new awareness of what it means to be oriented, what expectations about human intercourse are taken for granted, and how those expectations marginalize others. In distressing language, I've used disorientation as a window onto various projects of meaning-making, my own and those of other artists and writers. It's a commonplace of modernist criticism to see the aesthetic as a mediation of everyday life, the ordinary, the pre-reflective. Distributed voice is another version of that mediated experience, now produced through a digital transfer of information with its inevitable glitches and errors. In my introduction, I spoke about disability and deafness as the intersection of sound and gender and sexuality. Although in this talk I've not focused as much on the latter, I'd insist that the two areas are joined by their shared experience of disorientation. Sounding bad, speaking with a stammer, using sign language, mark individuals as living outside conversational protocols. Not conforming to binary codes of gendered identity mark the body as living in a queer time and space in Jack Halberstam's terms. To be heard, to be recognized, constitute what it means to be human. Errors of recognition become the occasion for oppositional practices, politics, and sociality. In earlier work on poetry, I described the materiality of contemporary poems as a palimptext. In order to stress the layered etiology of a poem, its historical and cultural sources, its evolution from notebook to chapbook to published poem to vocal recitation to mnemonic recreation. I was inspired by looking at the notebooks and manuscripts of the poet George Oppen, who layered his revisions physically, one on top of the other, using slips of paper and glue, the poem rising off the page as a midden heap of prior intentions. He literally cut out the new line and pasted it on top of the other one, and then the next revision. So pretty soon the manuscripts got real thick. And when I was editing the poems of Oppen, I looked at a lot of these manuscripts, and they were much more like a midden heap than they were like a classic document. I saw the text as an archaeological dig into material forms and practices of which the final published version is only the latest sediment. Little did I realize that the palimpsext would also describe the textualization of my own life, one that has been enriched by embracing error, by hearing the world through several modalities. As I said at the outset, disability is a form of pedagogy, not only of new capabilities, others presume as ability. Understanding the embodied text poses a new challenge for hermeneutics, forcing us as artists and critics to dig down into the matter of the body. Hearing its distressing language is a kind of poetry. Thank you.
So I think we have time for a few questions, which can come either from in the room or from in the chat.
Yeah,
yes, and
I'm hoping that Patrick will
transcribe.
Yes, I'd love to hear from you about any of these matters. And I've asked Patrick to act as a captioner. So if I don't understand what you're saying, maybe he can summarize your questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really wonderful and inspiring and so thoughtful lecture.
Good.
And, since error is in the title, but you haven't spoken very much about error, I was wondering whether you could maybe say a little bit more about this notion of error, because it implies something normative. And so how can we, dig a little bit deeper and see whether error could also be replaced by something else?
Yeah. I actually got that on Ava, by the way. That's a selling point of this, you can see. Aristotle uses the term hamartia, and we think of that as being tragic flaw, but it's also the foundational notion of error, which is so crucial to his theory of tragedy. So that's another way in which error has been in the realm of aesthetics from early on. There are chapters in the book. There's a chapter on mishearing. There's a chapter on misspeaking. And there's a chapter on missing music, what it means if you can't hear music, which I can no longer hear. Are there kinds of music that are not intended for the ear? So these are all different modalities of error, and they don't have the same valence as Aristotle gave to hamartia, meaning a fatal flaw which leads to downfall, but rather I want error to be recuperated as a positive value, something that, and this is why I think Jack Halberstam's work and other queer theorists who have really placed the issue of difference and failure in a positive light say, well, if we're all failures, let's make a politics out of that. Let's see if we can dig down and find some value in our difference. And that's one of the gains that I've learned from hearing loss and identifying with the deaf community a little bit more. Yeah. Other comments?
So one in the chat, or do you have one?
Yeah, I have one. So I work in early modern literature, and I just kept thinking about the figure of error in Spenser's Fairy Queen. I don't know if you remember, she's a dragon. And
way in the past.
Yeah.
Sorry.
In that poem, she's particularly Catholic errors. At least that's the way the allegory is read.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about her is she's feminized. She also is associated with birth. She vomits forth all kinds of textual errors.
Pandora.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in the ways in which you've pointed out so many positive ways of understanding error, but I was thinking about the ways in which it's also been historically feminized and demonized through these characteristics. Yeah.
I mean, that's why I think disability studies has aligned so strongly with gender and sexuality studies because, well, when you think about the fact that the historical treatment of women who were asking for suffrage in the 19th century, a whole series of psychoanalytic diseases were created, hysteria, nervous disorders, to characterize that presumption as an illness. And you could take the same thing in critical race theory to think about the way in which the immigrant body, the black body, could carry diseases. Or in the case of antebellum slaves, if they presumed to escape the plantation, there was a disease for that, drapetomania. And so I'm veering away from the issue of gender here, but I think that the alliance here for disability studies was always there in feminist theory. So those are the kind of strong cultural models. But there was always a body at the beginning of these new forms of cultural theory. In each of the areas that we now call cultural studies, the issue of a different body is so central. So it's very hard, and I say this when I used to teach disability studies classes, I'd say to students, well, how many of you are working in disability studies? Well, we don't do that. I'm doing critical race theory, I'm doing queer theory, I'm doing post-colonial theory. And in each of those categories, there is a figure of a disabled or different body that must be diagnosed, institutionalized, in some cases euthanized, because they don't fit. So that alliance is very important. That's why I'm kind of a strong supporter of disability studies, because I think it brings a lot of these areas together.
I've typed up the question while we were going on there. So, and this is perhaps 3 separate questions, so Michael, you can take whichever part you want. But I'm wondering how your experience of hearing loss, your engagement with disability studies, and perhaps particularly your encounter with the artists you've spoken about today has affected or inflected your own poetic practice.
Oh, that's a good question. I do write poetry too, and the manuscript that is now out there, I originally called Drone. I've changed the title, but the drone was the dominant tone that I heard all the time, and I wanted to get at the quality of sound that I could hear. Sound is very challenging for me now, and distortions are very, so I wanted to take the mistakes that I was experiencing in conversation and incorporate them into the poem, sort of like I was doing with the Ava transcriptions. I don't think of them as poems, but they're pretty interesting, and I wanted to at least poach on those possibilities. You know, in deaf studies, there's this term that people use called deaf gain. Deaf gain is the idea that deafness, hearing loss is the wrong term. Becoming deaf or being deaf and using ASL is a big advantage. It's not something to be disparaged. And in fact, ASL has many features that are productive and positive as a poetics. The condensation of long sentences into single signs, for example. So I was interested also in replicating certain signs to get at the economic quality of ASL, to sort of translate ASL signs into English, which I know is a heresy within capital D deaf culture. But I can't help it. I'm a hearing person. I'm not culturally deaf. But a lot of my deaf friends are willing to accept me as long as I sign. But my signing is bad, slow. I'm still learning. Did that answer some of your questions?
Yes, but I mean, there are other elements to it, but if you've...
Well, deaf studies and disability studies have been at odds over the years because, of course, deaf people don't like to think of themselves as disabled, and they would prefer to think of themselves as a linguistic minority. And I'm all for, the big tent. The more people who identify as disabled, deaf, crip, the better from a political standpoint. So you get accommodations, you get representation, you get attention paid to it. So I don't feel this is a problem, but I know that is an issue. And my ASL tutor, who is culturally deaf, of course, doesn't like to think of herself as being disabled, but she's willing to acknowledge that she needs accommodations when she goes to certain places. She'll need to have an interpreter present. That's provided by the ADA. So if you're using the accommodations provided by the ADA, then you fall under the umbrella called disability. But the main thing to keep in mind is that it's a complicated cultural issue, and not try and finesse this quickly by saying, no, you're really disabled or you're really deaf.
We have a question in the chat that says, is it possible that the screen sharing can be stopped so the speakers are more visible to remote attendees?
Yeah,
How do
we don't need to see the.
Yeah, is there a way to do that?
Just did it already, but
Oh,
there is
okay.
still this,
Okay.
I don't know, how you can remove that block in the middle there. Okay, there we go.
Does that work?
That was the request.
Okay.
Oh, wait.
But you're still on.
Yeah, you're still on.
Yeah.
And then do you want to share the next question in the chat, or should I? Do you have it there?
I don't have it there, no.
Should I read it out?
Sure.
As people in the academic field, which heavily emphasizes having clear and well-articulated thoughts, how do we create room for error, disability, and the continual process of learning? And that's Elias Schaefer.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because, of course, as an academic, I believe in clear, reasoned argument. And I don't back away from that. On the other hand, I think I have to bring up Donald Trump, of course, because there's a case where error is so abundant in his rhetoric and references that that would not be helpful as a model for academic clarity. So I think the fact that I'm emphasizing error, I'm emphasizing a recognition of difference, which is possibly another way of looking at this. Accommodating difference, accommodating different kinds of bodies in the classroom, different kinds of ideas, different kinds of forms, seems perfectly all right. To validate error qua error as the pursuit of truth doesn't seem very productive, because it just means that you're going to validate anything goes. What is the phrase that Trump uses? Alternate facts. That road leads nowhere. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I have one, but I'll.
Oh, no,
Yeah.
you've already asked, so go ahead. I'm just going to follow up.
Oh, I just wondered about whether there is a temporality or a theory of temporality that surrounds error. I mean, I noticed in your descriptions of these distributed voice,
Yeah.
recognition happens after the fact, or there's interruption, so that the temporality seems to shift when we're in the realm of art and error, and I just wondered about your thoughts on that.
Well, you're talking about crip time.
Yeah.
And crip time is the fact that all of us need more time or different kinds of time to accomplish goals, and yet we're dominated by what I call the chronometric dependency syndrome. You have to be there on time, and if you're not on time, you're considered lazy or irresponsible and so forth. So if you go to a disability studies conference, you find that there's lots of space, lots of time in between sessions. There's lots of accommodation for people who speak slowly, or like Larry Eigner, who don't speak so that you can understand clearly. And so temporality has to be rethought. Even from my own standpoint, going to a talk or being at a talk means I have to plan in advance to have a captioner. Other friends have to have interpreters and so forth. That takes time also. And it has an implication for the arts. Just thinking about the time it takes for Larry Eigner to type part of the poem. Somebody called his slow poetics. And of course, Larry Eigner lived during a period when immediacy and speed and projective verse were the centerpiece of contemporary poetics. Being fast. There's Larry.
Hi, this is a great talk. I'm curious, as a media studies scholar, about sort of your archive of creative text. You know, the title is Poetics. You talked about the time in which Eichner wrote. You also started us off with your, trajectory out of poetry. I'm wondering how you selected the creative texts you have, and sort of if you're making any sort of historically specific arguments or theorizing more across time.
So I'm making historically specific arguments because art and literature happen contextually to deal with certain kinds of conditions of production, for example. So it's a really great question. I've found that as somebody who was trained in literature, I had a hard time crossing over to visual arts, which became more important, and music, which had been central to my early life. I've written about music. I play the piano, or did play the piano. So that element had to drop away. And I thought, no, I'm going to make sure and continue to write about music, but from my standpoint, from the standpoint of someone who can't hear music. So John Cage becomes important. David Tudor becomes important. Lamont Young, Alvin Lucier, Pauline Oliveros, composers who were not necessarily creating music for sound, but for other kinds of experiences, haptic, vibrational, and so forth. And so it's been a learning curve for me. That's why I say it's a pedagogy. I've had to learn to look at different kinds of art forms beyond poetry and literature. And I've delved much more deeply into the novel, just because the treatment of disability in novels is often about finding the disabled figure and then focusing on that. So Tiny Tim, or Oedipus, or Lear. But then I want to talk a little bit about how the work, King Lear, the play, uses the disabled figure, and especially in the case of I mentioned Beethoven's example of Beethoven. What did Beethoven have to go through in order to think about the grosse Fuge, or the late quartets? How did his deafness empower and enable a kind of harmonic complexity and rhythmic complexity that he was always capable of that, but I'm just saying that these changes of direction were made largely possible by disability. So I guess a quick answer to your question is that I've had to be a kind of jackdaw, pulling from different places. Every time I run into somebody who's kind of interested in disability studies, I say, well, what works for you? And so media studies is where it's happening. At my university, the literature department doesn't want to know from disability, but the communications department That's where the disability studies emphasis is. And they have filmmakers, they have media theorists, they have people who work in journalism, and many of those people also are the Disability Studies Consortium. So you're in the right field.
Can I ask a follow-up? I'm also now starting to read in sound studies, and one of the interesting facts that likes to be pointed out there is that like film studies has so often been like a visual studies, but in at least since 1927, it's been an audio-visual medium. And so I'm just curious from someone who as someone who hasn't read deeply in deaf studies, how you see deaf studies and sound studies as in conversation or possibly tension or
Sound studies is the big field right now, and there have been a number of essays and books I can suggest to you. Business about distributed voice is very much influenced by the writings of Jonathan Stern, for example, and Vladan Gomar. I always have trouble with this, Mladen Dolar, and others. If you hang around afterwards, I'll give you a couple of suggestions. But and they are very critical of the way in which the visual has been seen as being the centerpiece of modernism. And they want to correct this and talk about the importance of sound all the way up to the present. And so there's a kind of insurrectionary move right now.
I think I want to wrap. So thank all of you so much. Thank you, Professor Davidson.